This absolutely has to be a dream, right? The kind of strange dream where we all wake up and collectively realize that Pokemon FireRed and Pokemon LeafGreen are not actually releasing on Nintendo Switch this week, because it still feels surreal to say that out loud. I've hoped for this for years, and even now that it's confirmed, it still doesn't quite feel real. What makes it even more interesting is that the news arrived a full week before Pokemon Day, alongside confirmation of a roughly 30-minute Pokemon Presents scheduled for February 27th, which is an annual tradition at this point. Still, I genuinely don't understand why they wouldn't just simply wait and reveal FireRed and LeafGreen during the Pokemon Day itself, although I'm certainly not going to complain. Honestly, I see this as an easy win. A 30-minute Pokemon Presents that leads directly into digital-only releases of FireRed and LeafGreen for $19.99 each means that by the time the presentation ends, half of us will already be hovering over that download button, pretending we're making a financially responsible decision. For longtime fans, that alone is enough to generate enthusiasm, because these are not just any versions of Kanto. For many players, FireRed and LeafGreen are the definitive versions, the ones that refined the original red, blue, and green formula while adding polish, expanded post-game content, and mechanical improvements that allowed the region to age far more gracefully than its Game Boy predecessors, which, let's be honest, it didn't exactly age gracefully. But what makes this announcement particularly interesting is not just that the games are returning, but how they are returning. Because the way Nintendo has positioned these titles says just as much about the franchise's future as it does its past. This is the Input Lag, where we thoughtfully analyze Nintendo news. If that's your vibe, subscribe. FireRed and LeafGreen are not included in the Nintendo Switch Online, and I actually think that's a good thing. NSO titles are convenient, but if FireRed and LeafGreen were folded into that library, Pokemon Home compatibility would almost certainly become more complicated, and features like save states or rewind could create unintended balance issues for a Pokemon title built around long-term progression. Games positioned to NSO can also feel transient, more like something you are temporarily accessing rather than truly owning, whereas positioning FireRed and LeafGreen as standalone purchases reinforces a sense of permanence, even if digital ownership itself remains a broader philosophical debate. More importantly, this approach underscores that mainline Pokemon titles are still treated as premium products, even decades later. The decision, however, has sparked criticism around the $19.99 price point, particularly since these are straightforward ports without additional gameplay enhancements or online multiplayer beyond local wireless. I understand that reaction because at $20 for a port in 2026 can feel steep at first glance, especially when subscription libraries have conditioned us to expect older games at no additional cost. Still, context matters. These games originally retailed for $39.99 on the Game Boy Advanced, and physical copies today frequently sell for far more than that on the secondary market, which means some of you have probably justified worse purchases on eBay at 3 in the morning. When framed in that context, $19.99 begins to look less like a cash grab and more like a bargain. At the end of the day, no one is required to buy it, but the pricing itself does send a signal. By choosing not to include these titles in Nintendo Switch Online, Nintendo reinforces that Pokemon is not simply part of a retro catalog, but rather a brand that maintains its individual commercial value across decades, standing slightly apart from the rest of the legacy library. For years, players who wanted to revisit FireRed or LeafGreen legitimately were limited to tracking down aging cartridges while relying on prehistoric hardware. Others turned to emulation, not necessarily out of disregard for intellectual property, but because accessibility simply did not exist. In that sense, this release represents something beyond nostalgia. It represents preservation, availability, and a tacit acknowledgement that legacy Pokemon titles still deserve space in the modern ecosystem. At the same time, there are important questions that remain unanswered, and those questions will ultimately determine how meaningful this release becomes. We know Pokemon Home compatibility will be supported, but the real question is to what extent. Traditionally, Pokemon Home allows two-way transfers between compatible titles, yet I suspect FireRed and LeafGreen may function more like a one-way bridge forward, allowing transfers out, but not necessarily back in. I would love to see full compatibility that allows players to move Pokemon from Paldea back into Kanto, assuming that they exist within the regional Pokedex. But if transfers into FireRed and LeafGreen are permitted, there's a strong possibility that home access could be gated behind the post-game, much like how the original titles required obtaining the Ruby and Sapphire before unlocking connectivity with Hoenn. Historically, Pokemon Home support does not arrive day one, often launching several months after release, so I wouldn't expect immediate compatibility here either. Another open question is the matter of event Pokemon. FireRed and LeafGreen featured several Pokemon locked behind item distributions, including Deoxys, Lugia, and Ho-Oh, which many of us only heard about from that one friend who insisted his uncle worked at Nintendo. Whether those distributions return will significantly influence how complete this re-release feels, because for collectors, complete is not just a descriptor, it's a goal. All of this invites a broader question about what comes next. If FireRed and LeafGreen are positioned as standalone 1999 digital releases outside of Nintendo Switch Online, it becomes increasingly likely that Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald would follow a similar model eventually, reinforcing the idea that mainline Pokemon releases remain segmented from subscription-based retro offerings. Yet beyond strategy and pricing, there is something undeniably comforting about seeing Pokemon FireRed and LeafGreen preserved in this way. These versions of Kanto refined the pacing, expanded the postgame with the Sevi Islands, modernized battle mechanics, and ultimately delivered an experience that many players still consider superior to later revisits of the region. Which means we now have yet another excuse to argue online about which Kanto remake is truly definitive, a debate that will almost certainly never end. Ultimately, FireRed and LeafGreen returning to the Nintendo Switch is not merely a nostalgic callback. It is a statement about brand value, preservation, and the enduring commercial strength of Pokemon as a franchise. By pricing these titles individually and positioning them outside of Nintendo Switch Online, Nintendo reinforces that even legacy Pokemon games are treated as premium experiences rather than archival extras. The real question now is not whether these games deserve to return, but how this decision shapes the future of Pokemon's classic catalog, and whether we are witnessing the beginning of a consistent strategy that keeps Pokemon separate from the broader retro ecosystem. If you're excited about Pokemon FireRed and LeafGreen, you're absolutely in the right place, and you should probably subscribe. If that excitement extends to Pokemon Pokopia, which releases in just about a week, then you'll probably want to check out this video where I break down Pokopia's Cloud Island feature in detail. If that kind of thoughtful deep dive is your thing, then I'll see you over there.